Hello and welcome to Around the Wickets, another episode of some interesting cricket news on ThePapare.com. Now, this week we want to focus our attention on Sri Lanka's tour of India as well as the Under-19 World Cup that the Sri Lankans didn't do too well. Now, the Sri Lankan tour of India, let's start off with that. Well, Sri Lanka got off to a dream start on a pitch that was seaming, that had a bit of bounce. Dinesh Chandimal did the right thing. He won the toss, put India into bat, and India was all out 101. The rest is history. But having said that, I don't really think that any one of the Sri Lankan fans expected too much out of the Sri Lankan lineup, because it was an inexperienced, a young lineup where the selectors were really looking to try and identify some talent that they could throw up during this tour. Now, talking about talent, there's one player that I think could go all the way in T20 cricket at least, and that's Dasun Shanaka. Now, on a seaming track, he was able to seam the ball a bit, and also he could hit the long ball. Now, these are ingredients that you need if you want to have a good T20 side. But the rest, as far as the Sri Lankans are concerned, winning the first game was good. Very impressed with the Kasun Rajitha, the way he bowled. The important thing was the areas he landed the ball. But there were also a few disappointing aspects in this Sri Lankan series against India, particularly the T20 series we're talking about. Well, first and foremost, I really didn't think that Sikuge Prasanna and Thisara Perera could both play in that same T20 side. Now, that's not because either of those players are substandard or not good enough. It's just that they appear to be very similar type of players. Sikuge Prasanna is an all-rounder who could hit the ball hard, but can he be expected to bowl his 4 overs? Now, that's the question, because he may come in, fill in an over or two. Thisara Perera can hit the long ball, but he's fast running out as a frontline bowler. So when you have two of those players, obviously Sri Lanka is going to falter somewhere. Now, in that second game, Sri Lanka, even in the first game, I felt that Sri Lanka was short of a genuine batsman. And in Asela Gunaratne, Sri Lanka should have played him from first game onwards. They didn't. They were lucky that they won the first game, and unfortunate that they just couldn't beat a very strong Indian side in that second game. Another thing that surprised me was winning the toss and putting India into bat in that second game. It looked a decent pitch. I would have thought runs on the board would have been the way to go as far as the Sri Lankans were concerned. But Dinesh Chandimal opted to try and defend the score, or rather chase the score, and give their bowlers the first preference. Maybe was just playing on that Indian mentality of being all out 101. So they were just trying to gain a few psychological points. Didn't work. Third game, again, I thought the Sri Lankans misread that pitch. Now, it was never a 160, 170 pitch. To me, it was a 130, 140 pitch. Now, on a pitch like that, the approach to me should have been different. Should have been looking to try and get the singles, try and build a score, get to about 130, 140, and give the bowlers a chance. Now, another thing was, when India made 82 for 1, just 2, now, what was the best chance for Sri Lanka? I mean, defending 82 runs, you need to get your wickets. So I would have thought Dushmantha Chamira, Dilhara Fernando, bowl your full quota of overs and see whether they could get those wickets for you and put some pressure on the Indians. So, well, these are all in hindsight after the series is over. But let's not forget that the Sri Lankans were playing a depleted side. So they weren't expected to win against India. So they need to use this experience to try and build for the Asia Cup and the World T20 that is ahead of Sri Lanka. Ambidextrous. Now, that's the name that is being coined in cricket today, and Sri Lanka has an ambidextrous spinner in Kamindu Mendis, who bowls left arm and right arm. Pretty unique. The Sri Lankans seem to be throwing up a lot of unique characters. Sanath Jayasuriya was one, Muralidharan was one, Lasith Malinga with his square arm action is another. Now we got somebody bowling with his left and right. So isn't that exciting times? Isn't it telling you that the Sri Lankans have talent, and Sri Lanka has exceptional talent, some unbelievable talent? And as I said, ambidextrous is a new word that will be used in the cricketing jargon or the cricketing language. But as far as the World Cup campaign, the Under-19 World Cup, I was disappointed. I was one who backed the Sri Lankan team to win this World Cup. But sadly, I felt it was the batting that really was a little bit too weak for the Sri Lankans, and as a result of that, I wondered whether the Sri Lankans were able to play their proper bowling combination. Now look at the India-West Indies match. The West Indies won that game with pace. They were able to defeat the Indians with extra pace, but the Sri Lankans played only 2 fast bowlers. Now that's because they needed a little bit of more batting cover. So, well, that's a poser to the selectors, but sadly, the Sri Lankans had their moments, had their chances, and I thought the Sri Lankans should have been a front runner as far as winning this World Cup. And also, watching the way the spinners bowled, particularly in that Indian game, the Indian spinners were more orthodox, looking to get wickets, while the Sri Lankan counterparts were looking to fire the ball in. So there were lots of little issues like that, but in the end, yet another World Cup campaign lost for Sri Lanka, and incidentally, losing that game for the 3rd place to Bangladesh rather badly. So that is a pretty disappointing outing for Sri Lanka in that Under-19 World Cup. Now let's get to the Asia Cup and the World T20. Now lots of calls for young cricketers were made before. They were talking about cricketers not good enough to play T20 cricket, and they were trying to segmentize the cricketers and identify them with different formats. But has Sri Lanka achieved their objective? What should be Sri Lanka's plan going forward? Now personally I feel, and listening to a lot of critiques, they tend to think that Sri Lanka need to have the right balance in terms of youth and experience. Now with Kusal Perera not available for the T20 World Cup, which is going to be a huge loss for Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankans will have to fall back on some tried and tested players. Talking about falling back on tried and tested players, 2 names that comes readily to my mind is Lahiru Thirimanne and Rangan Herath. If you look at Lahiru Thirimanne, when he was rested in those T20 games against the West Indies, if I'm not mistaken, with Dinesh Chandimal, Thirimanne hadn't really done too much wrong up to that point. His strike rate was good. He wasn't having a great average, but in T20 cricket, I mean, if you can average about anything between 25 and 30, you're doing brilliantly. And if you could average in around those 20 mark, close to that, you're all right. But the strike rate is what matters. And Lahiru Thirimanne, contrary to lots of people's views, was a fairly decent T20 player. Now, will the selectors want to bring him back? That's one question. And the other one, of course, is Rangan Herath. I think the selectors need to back him. Rangan Herath was one man who was extremely good when Sri Lanka won that World T20. Remember the game against New Zealand where he just ran riot and just spun the ball, spun a web around the New Zealand batsmen, and they just didn't know what to do. So lots of questions for the selectors. It's not going to be easy, and one area that the selectors will have to look at is who would do the second wicket-keeper's job. Now, Dinesh Chandimal will be the wicket-keeper. Sri Lanka will have to have a second wicket-keeper in that squad of 15. So their options may be a little bit limited in terms of picking their batsmen and bowlers, simply because they need to have a wicket-keeper. And I wonder whether Sri Lanka has a wicket-keeping all-rounder. So these are all posers to the selectors. Now, talking about a little bit further about the Asia Cup and the World T20, we do know that Sri Lanka has a new coach in Graham Ford. Now, well, sometimes the coaches can have this magic touch, as they say. You remember when Dave Watmore came in, Sri Lanka won the 1996 World Cup. But I believe the game has evolved and things have changed a lot from 1996 up to today. It's not purely a coach who can turn things around, but he could be a vital cog in that overall process. Now, can Graham Ford, who's a tried and tested, respected coach, be able to get the Sri Lankans really ticking, particularly the batsmen, because we do know that it was the batting that struggled, and the area that Sri Lanka needs to look at very closely is batting. And Graham Ford, I'm sure, will have a lot of work to do. He'll have to work with the likes of Thirimanne, Thisara Perera, Chandimal, if they want them back, and just give them the confidence that those players need to come back to that original level they were in. Well, with the Asia Cup and the World T20 happening, we know we call it the March Madness. Now, in case you're wondering what this March Madness is, March is the month where the Sri Lankan, particularly schoolboys, go mad. That's why we call it the March Madness. So much of big match cricket. Some top schools playing. Royal Thomian, Josephine Petright, Ananda Nalanda, Thurston Isipatana, well, Trinity Anthonians. The list is very, very long. Being a Sri Lankan fan, I'm sure you know that there are lots of big matches in March. And the good news is ThePapare.com will have live streaming. So ensure that you're with ThePapare.com. You'll have live streaming of all these big matches. So if you're not in Sri Lanka, you're out of the country, you could still listen and enjoy the big match and understand how your school is performing in that game that we all look forward to if we went to a school that played a big match. Well, so that's the story on Around the Wickets. We hope you enjoyed it. So we look forward to your company continuously as we bring you all these news and games and live streaming on the Papare.